Things looking up for Penn State as they enter the 2021 season. James Franklin and company coming off a 4-5 2020. They started off 0-5, but then won their last 4 games as they really started to put things together, getting some contributions from some young players on his roster. As Franklin enters his 8th season, they are inside the CBS top 25, sitting at number 18. But here's your Big Ten teams that are in the preseason top 25. Indiana's in there as well, Wisconsin, Iowa, and of course the highest ranked, Ohio State, one of the favorites for the college football playoff. And for more on Penn State and the season ahead, let's now welcome in CBS sports writer, college football, and a member of the Cover 3 podcast, Tom Fornelli. Tom, I'll start by asking you the obvious question. Why are Penn State inside the top 25?
Well, long story short, last year doesn't matter. I mean, I know that they went 4-5, but you have to consider the context of what last season was. The Big Ten originally was the conference to step out and say, you know what, we're canceling the season or we're postponing the season, before there was a shift in direction and they decided, you know what, no, wait, we changed our mind. We are going to have a season. So there was a very compact kind of training camp and build up to get ready to get games in on time. And then with Penn State in particular, we saw players get injured. We saw players who were NFL draft prospects opting out of the season and instead choosing to prepare for the NFL draft to get ready for their future. And it kind of left Penn State a little bit thin at spots that it had considered to be strengths going into the year. So not surprisingly, early in the season, this is a team that really struggled, and it lost, like you said, its first 5 games. But I think what people are really taking into consideration as far as where they're ranked in the preseason this year is that they did win their last 4 games of the year, and plus just the overall track record of Penn State in the Big Ten. I think we're all willing to look at last season as somewhat of a crazy anomaly than as to where Penn State is as a program. So they're expected to be one of the better programs in the country again this year.
And in terms of their offensive production, I mean, they were one of the top offensive producing teams in the Big Ten, despite that 4-5 record. And when you look at their quarterback, Sean Clifford, a guy who is kind of thrown in there to start because of quarterback issues that they had. But last year, you know, he struggled a little bit with turnovers, struggled a little bit with making some of the big plays. But this year, a lot of really nice weapons around him, aren't there, Tom?
Yeah, and he's also got another new offensive coordinator this year because, as you mentioned, Penn State's offense last year, when you look at the raw stats, wasn't terrible. They finished 3rd in the conference in points per game. It's just they were inconsistent, and there were a lot of turnover issues, particularly early in the year, that really derailed them. But going into this year, Mike Yurcich has come over as offensive coordinator. He typically in his career and elsewhere has brought more of a kind of passing attack, which is important for Penn State this year because they do have talent at the receiver position. Jahan Dotson is a huge big play threat. He's the #1 guy in that receiver core. But we saw last year freshmen like Parker Washington and Keandre Lambert-Smith getting plenty of time and showing a lot of potential. Tight end Brenton Strange is back. He'll be a sophomore. He's a kid with a lot of potential. And Sean Clifford is a quarterback that, you know, if you look at his overall numbers last year, he was kind of middle of the road, average Big Ten QB. But he kind of played 2 separate seasons because I mentioned those turnovers. For the early part of the year when Penn State was losing games, he was turning the ball over at an alarming rate. But in their 4-game win streak, I believe he only threw 1 interception in those 4 games. And surprisingly, they were the best Penn State games of the season. So I think if Clifford comes in, does a better job taking care of the ball from the onset of the season, this is an offense that is poised to be one of the top units in the conference behind Ohio State.
And when you look at the other side of that in terms of their running game, I mean, you have Noah Cain there, but then John Lovett, a 4-year producer, is coming in there. Here's a guy that can really, really add to this offense. What kind of a 1-2 punch do they represent for this Penn State team?
I think it's strong. I think the absence of Cain last year was huge on this offense because one of the problems Penn State had was Jahan Dotson was their only real big play threat. It was hard to move the ball in big chunks when you only have one guy the defense really needs to worry about taking the top off. Noah Cain brings that. Noah Cain has that big play potential that they sorely missed last year, and having that back is huge. And Lovett is a very effective running back as well. I don't think he's got quite the game-breaking ability, but he was in 2018 and 2019 in particular a very effective runner for Baylor, averaging over 5 yards per carry. So it gives you a really nice, solid 1-2 threat. And, you know, if we just go through the history of James Franklin as a head coach back when he was at Vanderbilt and even at Penn State, One of the hallmarks of all of James Franklin's best teams is they always have a strong run game. And last year, the run game wasn't very strong and Penn State struggled. So if Kane and Lovett are able to give them that kind of impact, as well as a couple other guys in that depth chart who will make an impact and get carries, this is a team that I think increases the floor and it really makes them probably what I would consider the biggest threat to Ohio State in the East Division.
In terms of a quality comparison, though, here, Tom, I mean, you've had names like Miles Sanders and Saquon Barkley out of Penn State. Where do these guys compare to names like that?
Well, there are very few Saquon Barkleys on this planet, so I think it would be very unfair to compare them to him. But I do think that Noah Cain, the difference between him and Miles Sanders as recruits, Sanders was more higher rated, but Cain is a very talented back who, in my mind, has a lot of the same features that Miles Sanders has, and he's very much the same fit. So depending on how he comes back from that injury and he's ready to play in 2021, I could see him having a season very similar to Sanders. But again, as far as Barkley, like I said, very few humans on the planet like Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, I know, but I got to try to shoehorn you into some kind of comparison there for that one, right? Okay, let's talk about the other side of the football in this defense. I guess there are some question marks here because only one returning starter on this defensive line. So when you look at the defense, is this the biggest issue for Penn State when you're looking at this team overall?
It is. I think that when you're going through the depth chart, this is the one area that stands out to you because, like you said, there's not many returning starters. PJ Mustipher is the only returner from the defensive line last year who will be back. But the good news for Penn State is they landed a couple of key impact transfers who I think will be able to step in right away. Derek Tangelo from Duke and Arnold Ekitizi, I think is how you pronounce it, from Temple, who was actually a very disruptive player and a very productive player in that Temple defense last year. So I think those guys are going to be able to step in and give the Penn State's defensive line a very solid foundation. My concern is I don't know about the depth behind them, but I do alleviate that a bit because this is a team with a secondary that I think is very talented and is very experienced, and I think could be one of the strengths of the team. And we're seeing in college football more and more, like, if you're going to compete at the top level, you have to have a strong secondary. And while there's some unknowns still throughout the defense as far as experience and returning starters, the good news is James Franklin and this Penn State coaching staff have done an excellent job of recruiting talent on the defensive side of the ball. And 9 times out of 10, at the end of the day, what matters more than anything on defense is talent. And I don't think there's much question about the level of talent that the Nittany Lions are going to have on the side of the ball. So while it may be a slow start, I think that as we get going into the year and everybody kind of learns their place, this will probably be one of the top defensive units in the conference as well.
And as you mentioned, if you can hang on to the football, not turn it over, your defense on the field less, so that puts them fresher for later parts of the game. Okay, let's talk about their schedule here because this defense is going to get a good test right out of the gate. They've got Wisconsin on the 4th of September, and then I don't want to say things ease up a bit, but when you look down the schedule towards Ohio State in Week 8, I mean, when you look at it, they get through Wisconsin, they could be, maybe 7-0 by the time they hit Ohio State, maybe a 6-1. Is there a game in those early weeks, Tom, that you're kind of circling on their schedule?
I think, obviously you mentioned the Wisconsin game to start the season and the Ohio State road game later in the year. Those are probably the biggest games on the schedule, but the most interesting game to me is one of those non-conference games. Auburn, doing a thing that SEC teams rarely do, is heading north to play Penn State in Happy Valley. And I think that's a huge game simply for confidence reasons because no matter what happens with that result of Wisconsin, if Penn State comes away with a win or even with a loss, this is a huge Auburn game. This is a huge chance for them to really kind of set the tone for where they are as a program, not just for themselves, but as for the perception of the Big Ten, because the Big Ten doesn't really get a whole lot of chances during the regular season to beat not only SEC opponents, but to beat some of the top higher tier SEC opponents, teams that have competed and won national titles in recent memory. So I think that's going to be a huge game. I think that's going to be a tremendous atmosphere. And if Penn State's able to knock off Auburn in that game, I think that could set them up very well to be a team that you consider all season long as a legitimate playoff threat with that Ohio State game looming.
I think they're looking at possibly 2 whiteouts this season. I think producer Noah was talking about that. I just love to see the band leader there, so I wanted to extend that little video a little bit there. Okay, 4-5 last season. 4-5 equals 9 when they add them together. That is what their win total is set at for this year, 9. Tom, are you under that number, over that number, or right at that number?
I think that 9 is the exact right number for what Penn State is likely to be. I think 9-3, and it always annoys me when sports books take the cowardly way out and go with an even number instead of hanging a hook on there, giving us 8.5 or 9.5. But I think that 9 is where it's going to like. But as far as if I have to place a bet, and I don't love either side of this, I would lean under because while I think 9-3 is the most likely outcome, I think 8-4 is slightly more likely than Wisconsin or at 10-2 because those games against Wisconsin, Auburn, at Ohio State, at home versus Michigan, it's not difficult to see the Nittany Lions losing the 2 road games against Wisconsin in the opener and at Ohio State. So then they'd have to be perfect throughout the rest of the season to avoid, not getting that over. So I think the under is the smarter play. But again, I don't really love either side. I think the books are on 9 for a reason.
Tom, Amanda asked yesterday about Iowa being a value pick in terms of winning the Big Ten. So would you call Penn State a value pick?
I think there's more value on Penn State than there is on Iowa, just because I think that the talent-wise of that roster, the level that they're at, they are much more inclined to compete with Ohio State than an Iowa would be. But that said, they also have the more difficult path because they do have to play at Ohio State. Whereas at least if Iowa or a team like Wisconsin, whoever wins the Big Ten West, if they get Ohio State in the Big Ten championship, it's at a neutral site. Penn State doesn't have that advantage. So that's kind of a really big obstacle for them. But I do think that when I look at the Big Ten, I think that Ohio State has separated itself entirely from the rest of the conference, really, when it comes to, national title contenders. But when it comes to the teams that I think have a legitimate shot or at least a reasonable shot of upsetting Ohio State and winning the conference, Penn State's one of the first names that comes to mind. So there is some value on it, yes.
CBS Sports college football writer Tom Fornelli joining us as we continue to break down the CBS Sports Top 25 as we head towards the college football season. Tom, good to see you. Great stuff as always. Of course, the previews will continue as we head towards the opening day of the college football season. USC coming up tomorrow, number 16, and then Monday it is the Hurricanes from Miami and LSU on Tuesday.
Want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis. No yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.